The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1882, kicking up a red dust cloud that settled over the main street like a fine funeral shroud. And every soul who watched it arrive could not have guessed that the woman stepping down from its door would change the town, and one particular man, forever. Martha Bancroft pressed one slender hand against the wooden side of the coach and stepped down onto the dry earth of Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, with her chin lifted and her dark eyes moving carefully over the street before her. She was 24 years old, with black hair pinned beneath a traveling hat, and a dress of deep blue cotton that had seen better days but still carried itself with a kind of dignity that seemed to belong to her naturally. She was beautiful in a serious, composed way, the kind of beauty that did not announce itself but settled over you quietly, like you had only just noticed the mountains in the distance had been there all along. She looked left and then right, taking in the long wooden storefronts, the water trough where two horses stood flicking their tails, the smell of hay and smoke and cattle that hung over everything, and she pressed her lips together and reached back into the coach to pull out a worn leather traveling bag. Underneath her arm she tucked a small cloth-wrapped bundle, and she stood in the middle of the street looking like a woman who had prepared herself for everything except the specific thing that was now happening. The stagecoach driver climbed down from his seat and set her trunk on the ground beside her with a thud that raised another small cloud of dust. He pulled his hat off, mopped his forehead, and said something to her in English that she did not respond to. "Miss," he said again louder, "Miss, you got somebody meeting you here." Martha turned to him and said, in careful, measured Spanish, "Estoy buscando a la familia Hennessy. Mi dijeron que vivían cerca de aquí." The driver stared at her. He turned his head and looked at the small crowd that had gathered on the boardwalk, in the way that small crowds in small towns always gathered when the stagecoach arrived. The dry goods owner leaning on his doorframe, two women in aprons, an old man on a bench with his hat pulled low, a boy of about 10 sitting on the fence post. "She's talking some foreign talk," the driver announced to nobody in particular. One of the women on the boardwalk, a tall woman with iron-gray hair named Edna Crawley, stepped forward. She looked at Martha with a measuring look, the kind that could have been curiosity or judgment and was probably both. "What are you saying, dear?" she said loudly as though volume might bridge the gap. Martha looked at her and said again, quietly but clearly, "Busco a la familia Hennessy, Thomas Hennessy. Mi environ desde Albuquerque." Edna Crawley shook her head. "Can't make heads nor tails of it," she said, stepping back. The small crowd murmured. The boy on the fence post leaned forward to get a better look. The dry goods owner shrugged and went back inside. One of the apron women leaned toward the other and whispered something that made the other one press her lips together and look away. Martha stood very still in the middle of all of this, holding her bag and her bundle, and she did not look frightened. She looked the way a person looks when they have crossed too many miles to afford the luxury of fear, when you have already used up every reserve of courage just getting to the place, and now you have to hold the line with whatever is left over. She was a mail-order bride. She had come from Albuquerque, originally from a small village in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, and before that from a family that had worked the land for 3 generations. Her English, when she had left home, consisted of 3 words: yes, please, and thank you. She had been arranged through a letter-writing agency to marry a man named Thomas Hennessy, a cattle farmer outside of Harlan Creek, and she had traveled 4 days on the stagecoach with her trunk and her bundle, and the agency's letter of arrangement to present herself as agreed. What nobody had told Martha, what the agency had apparently either not known or not considered worth mentioning, was that Thomas Hennessy had died of a fever 6 weeks before her arrival. None of the people on the boardwalk knew exactly how to explain this to her in a language she could understand. The crowd had mostly dispersed, drifting back to their own business with the particular relief of people who have witnessed a difficult situation and decided it was not theirs to solve, when Roy Wells came around the corner of the livery stable at the far end of the street. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that needed shaving and boots that had been resoled twice. He wore a faded gray shirt and a brown canvas coat, and his hat was pushed back on his head at the angle of a man who wore it more out of habit than any attention to appearance. He worked at the livery stable, had worked there for 4 years, and he had the quiet, contained manner of someone who had learned a long time ago that most talking was not worth doing. He came around the corner and stopped. He saw the woman standing in the street with a trunk at her feet and a bag under her arm, and the way she was standing, not lost, not pitiful, but absolutely alone in a crowd that had already given up on her, hit him somewhere in the chest before he had even processed the details. He stood watching for a moment. He saw Edna Crawley disappear into the mercantile. He saw the stagecoach driver climb back up to his seat. He saw Martha Bancroft reach up and straighten the pin in her hat with one hand, a small automatic gesture of composure, and he found himself walking toward her before he had made any decision to do so. "Hola," he said, when he was close enough that he did not have to raise his voice. She turned and looked at him. "Habla usted español," he said. His accent was rough, the accent of someone who had learned a language from workers and neighbors rather than from any schooling, but the words were right. Something moved across Martha Bancroft's face. It was not relief exactly, not yet, because she was too careful for that, but it was the loosening of something that had been held very tight, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a glass of water when they have been walking a long time. She said, "She hablo español." Roy Wells pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "Then let me help you," he said, in careful Spanish that was slow and a little broken but absolutely sincere. "You are looking for someone." "Thomas Hennessy," she said. "I am looking for Thomas Hennessy. I am supposed to marry him." Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hat, then back up at her, and his expression did something complicated. "Miss," he said slowly, "I have to tell you something, and I am very sorry for it. Thomas Hennessy died 6 weeks ago. The fever took him. There is nobody in this town who knew how to contact you, or perhaps they did not try as hard as they should have." The words landed between them. Martha did not cry. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed most hard things in her life, by going very still and letting it settle, the way water finds its level. She looked at Roy Wells, and then she looked down the street, and then she said very quietly, "I see." "I am sorry," he said again, because it was the only thing that seemed true enough to say. "Where is his house?" she asked. "His farm is about 3 miles east. His brother has it now." She was quiet. Roy watched her. The afternoon sun was dropping behind the roofline of the saloon across the street, and the shadows were getting long, and the temperature was already beginning to fall, the way it did in the high desert in spring, where the days burned and the nights remembered winter. "I have nowhere to go," she said finally, and she said it without any particular inflection, the way you state a plain fact, not looking for pity but simply establishing the truth of things. "There is a boarding house," Roy said carefully. "Mrs. Delgado runs it. She speaks some Spanish. You could stay there while you figure out what to do next." Martha looked at him. She studied his face with the directness that he would come to learn was simply her way, a kind of clear-eyed assessment that felt like being measured and found, somehow, acceptable. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Roy turned his hat another revolution. "Because you needed somebody to," he said, "and everybody else went inside." She considered this. Then she bent and picked up the handle of her trunk. "Show me," she said. He reached down and took the trunk from her before she could protest, and she let him, and they walked down the main street of Harlan Creek together in the long afternoon light, the woman who spoke only Spanish and the quiet man from the livery stable who had learned just enough to stay. Mrs. Delgado's boarding house sat at the southern end of town, a 2-story white-painted structure with a porch that needed attention and window boxes full of red geraniums that did not. Consuelo Delgado was a small, wide woman of 60, originally from Santa Fe, who had come to Harlan Creek 20 years earlier with her late husband and had outlasted him. outlasted the first drought, outlasted the fire of 1876, and outlasted the general opinion of a town that had not always been sure what to make of her. She opened her door to Roy's knock and looked at Martha, and then looked at Roy and switched immediately into Spanish that was so fast and so warm it was like a dam breaking. Martha's whole body changed. She answered and they spoke, and Consuelo reached out and touched Martha's face and shook her head and said something that made Martha breathe out slowly, and then Consuelo looked at Roy and said in English, "You did right bringing her here. Come inside, both of you." They sat in Consuelo's front room, which smelled of chili and candle wax, and Consuelo brought coffee and told Martha everything she needed to know about the situation. And Martha sat with her cup in both hands and listened and asked questions and listened more. Roy sat quietly across from them, catching enough to follow but mostly just being present because it seemed to him that being present was the best thing he had to offer at the moment. At one point, Martha looked across at him and said, in slow and deliberate English that surprised him considerably, "Thank you for staying." He looked back at her. "You're welcome," he said in Spanish. She almost smiled. It was the barest beginning of one, there and gone in an instant, but he saw it, and it did something to him that he did not examine too closely. He left when the sun went down, walking back up the street toward the livery where he had a small room behind the stalls. He fed the horses their evening hay and checked the water in the trough and stood for a while in the warm, dark smell of the stable, thinking about a woman with black hair and dark, direct eyes saying, "You did right bringing her here," and the way she had said it, like it was not nothing. He had come to Harlan Creek 4 years ago from Arizona, from a life he had left largely behind and did not discuss in great detail. He had been a ranch hand before the livery, and before that he had worked cattle drives up through Texas, and before that he had spent 2 years working alongside Mexican vaqueros in the borderlands south of Tucson, which was where his Spanish had come from, rough and functional and honestly earned. He was not the kind of man who made friends easily or enemies at all, and most of the town knew him as reliable and quiet and competent, which was, in his estimation, enough. He had not thought, walking to work that morning, that this would be a day that changed anything. The next morning, Roy was hammering a new shoe on a bay gelding when Edna Crawley came into the stable, which she never did, because Edna Crawley did not like the smell of horses and made this known frequently. He looked up from the hoof he was working on. "Roy," she said, standing carefully away from the horse, "what do you know about that woman you brought to Consuelo's last night?" "I know she came a long way to marry a man who didn't have the decency to stay alive," he said, setting the hoof down. Edna's mouth tightened. "That is not what I mean, and you know it. The town is talking. A woman who cannot speak English, no family here, no husband, no arrangement. What is she going to do?" "She is going to figure that out," Roy said. "Roy, I am only saying that people are wondering." "Let them wonder," he said, and picked up the next shoe. Edna Crawley left the way she had come in, and Roy finished the gelding and washed his hands and walked down to Consuelo's, because it had occurred to him that Martha Bancroft might need something from the mercantile or the dry goods store, and that it would go better with a translator. He found her on Consuelo's porch in the morning light, sitting in the chair with a small book open in her lap. He came up the path and she looked up. "You came back," she said in Spanish. "I thought you might need someone to go to the store with you," he said. She considered him. "You have work today?" "Not until this afternoon." She closed the book, which he could see now was a small Bible, and stood up. "Then yes, I need some things." They walked to the mercantile together, and Roy did the talking, because the mercantile was run by a man named Harold Birch who had no patience for what he called foreign nonsense, and Roy simply said what Martha needed in plain English and put it on the counter and paid the difference from what Martha had. And Harold Birch kept his opinions to himself because Roy Wells had the quiet, settled kind of presence that made opinions seem inadvisable. Walking back, Martha said, "How did you learn Spanish?" He told her about Arizona, about the vaqueros, about the 2 years of learning from people who were generous enough to teach him even though he made many mistakes and probably said embarrassing things for the first 6 months. She listened carefully. "You learned because you wanted to," she said. "Because it seemed useful," he said. "And because the men who were teaching me deserved to be understood." She looked at him sideways. "That is a better reason," she said. He did not know what to do with that, so he just walked, and she walked beside him. And the morning sun was warm and the street was dusty and ordinary, and it felt like something very quiet and very important was beginning. Over the following week, Roy came by Consulo's every morning, and sometimes in the evenings too, because he had the feeling, which he could not have articulated but which persisted, that Martha Bancroft should not be left entirely to navigate this town on her own. He was her interpreter by default, which meant he accompanied her to the post office, where she sent a letter back to her family in Chihuahua explaining what had happened, and to the office of the Justice of the Peace, where she needed to understand what her legal standing was now that the man she had come to marry was dead. The Justice of the Peace, a dry little man named Everton Price, told Roy to tell her that since the marriage had never taken place, she had no claim on the Hennessy property and no legal connection to anyone in Harlan Creek, and that she was free to go wherever she pleased, which sounded, in Everton Price's delivery, very much like an invitation to go somewhere else. Roy translated this, and Martha listened and then said, "Ask him if there is any work available for a woman who can sew and cook and manage a household." Everton Price blinked when Roy relayed this. "What kind of a question is that?" he said. "The kind a woman asks when she is trying to figure out how to survive," Roy said. Price had nothing useful to say, so they left. On the walk back, Martha said, "I am not going back to Chihuahua." "No," Roy said. "I left for a reason," she said, and did not elaborate, and he did not push. "Some doors you left closed until a person chose to open them." What she did tell him, over the course of those first days, in pieces and fragments that he was beginning to assemble into a fuller picture, was that she had 3 younger siblings and a mother who was still living and a father who had died 4 years earlier, and that the arrangement to come to Harlan Creek had been partly practical and partly the result of a family that had not quite known what to do with a daughter who was too proud and too independent for the options available in her village. She was not bitter about this. She stated it with the same plainness she stated everything, but he could hear, underneath the plainness, that she had made her peace with it through considerable effort. She had spent the first week teaching herself English. Not teaching herself exactly, because she had no teacher, but she had Consulo's old Bible in English, and she had a copy of a newspaper that someone had left behind in the boarding house, and she was using them like tools, tracing the words and matching them to what she knew in Spanish, and the speed at which she was doing it was remarkable. Roy noticed this when he arrived one morning and she greeted him with "Good morning," and then when he looked surprised said, "I practice. You will help me." "Of course," he said, so their mornings took on a new shape. Roy would come in the morning and they would sit on Consulo's porch or at her kitchen table, and Martha would point at things and Roy would name them in English, and she would repeat them until they sat right, and then she would use them in sentences, and he would correct the sentences, and she would absorb the correction and try again. She was a ferocious learner. She did not let herself be embarrassed by mistakes, which he found remarkable because most people did. She simply noted the correction and moved on, and the speed at which words were becoming available to her was something he found himself watching with a quiet admiration that he also did not examine too closely. He also taught her, because she asked, and because teaching was a good excuse to spend mornings on a porch in the spring air with someone whose company he found inexplicably necessary, which was a thing he was beginning to notice. Consulo noticed it before either of them did, or at least before either of them would admit to it. "Roy Wells," she said to him one afternoon when Martha had gone upstairs to rest, speaking in English so there was no ambiguity about the audience for her words, You come here every morning and every evening, and you sit on my porch for 2, 3 hours with that woman. She needs a translator, Roy said. She needs a lot less translating than she did 3 weeks ago, Consuelo said, with the tone of someone making a point that deserves an unobstructed landing. My porch is nice, but it is not what brings you here. Roy looked at his hands. She is a good woman, Consuelo said more gently. You could do considerably worse, but you should be honest about why you keep coming. He left without answering, but the question stayed with him all afternoon, following him through the stalls and the work and the comfortable routine of the livery. And by evening he had arrived at an honesty he had not been prepared to admit that morning. He kept coming because he wanted to, because the hours on that porch were the best hours of his day. Because Martha Bancroft had a way of listening to everything you said as though it was worth hearing, and a way of saying things that surprised him consistently, and a directness that made him feel, in her presence, like pretending was not an option, and that was a relief rather than a burden. Because she laughed occasionally and briefly, but genuinely at things he said, and the laugh was warm and low and caught him off guard every time. And because she was brave. Because she was brave in the specific way that people are brave who have no audience for it, no one cheering, just the daily work of keeping your chin up in a town that spoke a language you were in the process of learning and had not exactly welcomed you with open arms. That kind of bravery was the kind he most respected, because it had no gallery, no applause, just the quiet daily commitment to staying upright. He thought about this for the rest of the week and the week after that, and he did not do anything about it, because he was also the kind of man who thought carefully before doing things, and because he was not entirely sure how to do anything about it, and because Martha had not given him any clear signal that she thought about him the same way, and he was not the kind of man to assume. What he did not know was that Martha Bancroft, lying awake in her room at Consuelo's boarding house with the desert wind coming through the window screen, was thinking about him too. She had not expected him. She had expected at best to arrive in Harlan Creek and find a decent man who would treat her fairly, and to build from that foundation a life that was better than the one she had left. She had not been in love with Thomas Hennessy, had never met him, had known him only through 4 letters that had been stiff and formal and pleasant enough. She had been practical about the arrangement, because practicality was what the situation required. Roy Wells was not a practical consideration. Roy Wells had stayed when everyone else went inside. Roy Wells had walked up to her in the middle of a street full of people who had already decided she was not their problem, and had said hola in an accent that was rough and careful and entirely genuine, and had picked up her trunk without being asked, and had not once, in all the weeks since, made her feel like the understanding she needed was a burden. He listened to her, not just translated listened. There was a difference, and she had never had to explain the difference to herself before because she had not previously met someone who made her feel it so clearly by contrast. She was also, she admitted to herself in the dark of the desert night, not unaware that he was attractive in the uncomplicated way of someone who has worked hard all his life and has nothing to prove about it. She was aware of his hands when he pointed at words in the newspaper. She was aware of the sound of his voice when he was explaining something carefully. She was aware of the way he sometimes went quiet in the middle of a conversation, not from boredom but from thinking, and then said something that was better for having been considered. She was also aware, with the caution of a woman who had traveled a very long way on an arrangement that had not held, that awareness and sentiment were not the same thing as wisdom, and that she needed to be practical, and that Roy Wells had not said anything that was not related to translation or assistance, and that she should not be building castles on foundations that had not been offered. She had come to Harlan Creek as a bride. The groom was gone. What she needed now was a plan, not a feeling. She was very sensible about this, for approximately another week. It was a Thursday in late May, and Roy came by Consulo's and found Martha in the yard behind the house, hanging washing on the line that Consulo had strung between two posts, and she was singing quietly to herself in Spanish, a song he did not know. She did not hear him come around the corner of the house, and he stood for a moment listening, which he would not have done if he had been thinking clearly. But he was not thinking clearly, because the sound of her voice was something he had not heard before, and it was very affecting. She turned and saw him and stopped singing and looked at him, and then looked at him more carefully because something in his expression must have given him away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Roy," she said his name with a slight Spanish softening of the R that he had become very fond of hearing. "What is it?" "I was listening," he said. "I am sorry." "You should not be sorry for listening," she said. "I am the one who has been telling you to listen." He came into the yard and leaned against the fence post. The morning was warm already, the desert already doing what it did in May, and the sun was bright on the white of the shirts she was hanging. "Martha," he said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something." She waited. She had the patience of someone who had learned that good things, when they came, were worth waiting for without fidgeting. "I come here every morning," he said, "because I want to, not because you need a translator. You don't need a translator much anymore. I come because—" he paused, turned his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was the thing he did when he was choosing words carefully, "because the mornings I don't come are worse than the ones I do. And I think you ought to know that." Martha looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved the washing on the line between them. "I have been thinking something similar," she said carefully. He looked up. "You have?" "About the mornings," she said. "Yes." Something shifted between them like a weight that had been held slightly off-center finding its balance. "I don't know how to," he started. "Roy," she said quietly, "I have traveled 800 miles alone to a town full of strangers because I was trying to build something. I'm not afraid of trying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you take a walk with me this evening, after supper?" "Yes," she said simply, and turned back to the washing. And he stood there for a moment feeling something open in him that had been closed for a considerable time. And then he went back around the corner of the house and up the street to work. And he was not entirely sure his boots touched the ground the whole way. They walked that evening along the edge of town, where the last buildings gave way to open land, and the sky in the west was doing what the sky in New Mexico does at evening, which is to say it was being spectacular. Bands of orange and deep rose and a purple that deepened as they walked, and the air smelled of sage and warm dust, and something green from the direction of the creek that gave the town its name. Martha walked beside him, not holding his arm, just walking close, and they talked in the easy mixture of Spanish and English that their conversation had become, neither of them entirely in one language and neither of them entirely in the other. The two languages woven together the way everything in the borderlands wove together if you were paying attention. He told her about Arizona. Not just the vaqueros, but more a little about the years before, about a young man who had thought he wanted one life, and had built most of it before realizing it did not fit him well, and had walked away from it, and spent several years afterward not quite knowing what he was building toward, just working and moving and learning. He told her about coming to Harlan Creek in the livery, and how the work had suited him, and how the town had eventually become familiar, though not always easy. She told him about Chihuahua, about her father, who had been a farmer with a poet's heart and a bad back, who had died when she was 20 and left the family in a condition that required everyone to be practical in new ways. About her mother, who was small and fierce and could make a meal for 7 people out of what most people would have called nothing. About her siblings, a brother named Louis who was 16 now and the image of their father, and 2 sisters, Rosario and Pilar, who were 12 and 9 respectively. About the agency that had connected her with Thomas Hennessy and the way she had sat at the table with the letter of arrangement and told herself this was the right thing, the practical thing, and how she had believed it. "Did you want to come?" Roy asked. She considered this honestly. "I wanted to go," she said, "which is not quite the same thing. I wanted something different. I wanted," she paused, looking at the purple sky to see what was possible. "And now you're here," he said. "Now I am here," she agreed. "And it is very different from what I expected." "Better or worse?" he asked, and then immediately felt it was too forward a question. She looked at him. "So far," she said, "considerably better." He did not know what to do with the warmth that caused in him, so he just kept walking, but he was aware that he was smiling, which was not something he did carelessly. The weeks that followed were a slow and deliberate and very specific kind of happiness. Not the rushing, falling kind of happiness that exists in novels, but the kind that builds like a structure, one morning at a time, each day adding something to what had already been built, until the thing was solid enough to stand on. They walked most evenings if the weather permitted. They talked on Consuelo's porch in the mornings. Martha's English grew with a speed that still astonished him, and she was beginning to have conversations with people in town on her own with Consuelo's help at first, and then increasingly without it. She had found work at last, with a woman named Iris Hartwell who ran the town's small seamstress shop and needed someone who could take in piecework and was willing to work for fair wages. Martha could sew with a precision that made Iris Hartwell raise her eyebrows the first time she saw it, and the arrangement suited both of them well. Having work changed something in Martha's bearing, not her dignity. She had always had that, but something more settled, more rooted. She was no longer simply staying in Harlan Creek. She was beginning to belong to it, or to build the kind of belonging that comes from making yourself useful. Some of the town adjusted to her presence more graciously than others. Consuelo remained her anchor. Iris Hartwell, who was practical and not much interested in anyone's origin as long as they did good work, was fair. The postmaster learned that Martha's letters to Chihuahua and her family's letters back to her were going to be a regular occurrence, and accepted this. The woman who ran the bakery 2 doors down from Consuelo's, a wide-faced woman named June Perry, smiled at Martha when she passed and eventually offered her a piece of apricot pie through the window, which Martha accepted with a seriousness that made June Perry laugh. Edna Crawley, for her part, maintained a careful distance, which was the best that could be hoped for from Edna Crawley. Then there was Dale Hennessy. Thomas Hennessy's brother was a large man of 40, red-faced and suspicious, who had not liked it from the start when word got around that the woman Thomas had sent for was still in town rather than going back where she came from. He came into the mercantile one afternoon when Roy was there helping Martha ask Harold Birch about something for the seamstress shop, and he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt and said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "What exactly is that woman still doing in my brother's town?" Roy turned from the counter. "She is buying thread," he said with a flatness that could have frozen a stream. "She has no business here," Dale Hennessy said. "Thomas is dead. The arrangement is done. She ought to go back." "The arrangement being done means she has no obligation to you or your family," Roy said. "It doesn't mean she has to leave." "She doesn't belong here," Dale said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had said this kind of thing often enough that it had become a reflex. Martha had been following most of this. Her English was not perfect, but it was good enough, and she understood the meaning if not every word. She turned from the counter and looked at Dale Hennessy with the direct, level look that Roy had come to know well, and she said in English that was careful and clear, "I live here. I work here. I mean no harm to anyone." Dale Hennessy blinked. He had not expected her to respond in English. He had not expected her to respond with such composure. He muttered something and left, and Roy turned back to the counter and Martha stood beside him, and she was very composed and very steady, and only the fact that she did not quite look at him for a moment told him what it had cost her to say those words out loud in a language she was still learning. "You did well," he said quietly. "I practiced that," she said. He looked at her. "Those sentences," she said. "I live here, I work here, I mean no harm. I practiced them, in case." Something ached in him for her, for the care and preparation and self-reliance of a woman who practiced sentences in private so that she could hold her ground in public, and he wanted to say something adequate to the moment and could not find what it was, so instead he just said, "Let's go get the thread and go home." And she noticed that he said home, meaning Consuelo's, and the word settled over her in a way she could not have explained but that she felt precisely. The last week of June was hot even by New Mexico standards, and the creek had gone low and the air above the street shimmered in the afternoons, and everyone moved a little more slowly. Roy finished work early one Friday and took 2 horses from the livery, with permission from his employer, a weathered Scotsman named Angus MacTavish, who had grown fond of Martha's visits to the stable in the way that practical men grow fond of people who treat horses with respect, and rode down to Consuelo's. Martha came out when she heard hooves, shading her eyes with one hand, and looked at him and then at the horses. "Can you ride?" he asked. "My father taught me," she said. He handed her the reins of the smaller horse, a gray mare named Dust, and she swung up with an ease that demonstrated she was not exaggerating, and they rode east out of town, away from the buildings and the dust and the noise, out onto the open plain where the late afternoon light lay flat and golden over everything, and the sky went on until it hurt to look at. They rode to the creek, which still had water in the deeper pools even in the heat, and they dismounted and let the horses drink while they sat on the bank, and the shade of the cottonwood trees along the creek was the best thing that had happened to the afternoon. Martha took off her hat and set it in the grass and leaned back on her hands and looked up through the cottonwood leaves at the sky. Roy sat near her, watching the horses, watching the water, watching eventually her. "Roy," she said without looking down from the trees. "Yes. What do you want? Not about me, for yourself. What do you want from your life?" He thought about this. "I want to stay somewhere," he said. "I've moved around enough. I want to build something, something that lasts." "What kind of something?" "A place," he said. "Land I've been saving, not enough yet, but I've been saving. A small place east of town, maybe. There's a good stretch of land out past the Hennessy property that nobody has claimed, good water access." She was quiet. "That is a good dream," she said. "What do you want?" he said. She was quiet longer this time, and he let her be because Martha's silences were never empty, they were the sound of thinking. "I want to belong somewhere," she said finally. "Not just to survive somewhere, to belong, to have people who know my name and are glad of it. To know that my children, if I have them, will grow up somewhere safe where they can also belong." He was very quiet beside her. "I know that sounds like a great deal," she said. "It doesn't sound like a great deal," he said. "It sounds exactly right." She looked at him then, and he was already looking at her, and the cottonwood light moved between them, and he said, in the careful, deliberate Spanish he always used when he wanted to be sure he was understood exactly right, "Martha, I want to say something, and I want to be sure I say it properly." "Then say it," she said, also in Spanish. "I have not felt this way about anyone," he said. "Not in a long time, maybe not ever with this kind of certainty. I know we have only been in this situation for a matter of weeks, and I know you came here for a different reason, and I know I am not what you were arranged to come here for. But I want you to know that I am serious, that what I feel is serious, and that if you were ever willing, I would like to ask you properly, when the time is right." She looked at him for a long time. The horses stood in the shallows and flicked their tails, and the creek made its low sound over the stones. "I am telling you now," she said quietly, "so that you do not waste time wondering. The time will be right." He breathed out, slow and steady, like a man who has been holding something for a long time. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed, and put her hat back on, and they rode back to town in the long golden evening with the horses walking easy and the stars just beginning to appear in the eastern sky. The summer deepened. Roy began spending his Sundays at the patch of land east of town that he had his eye on, and Martha began coming with him, and they would walk the ground together, and he would point out where the house could go and where the water could be run, and she would stand and look and make suggestions that were practical and good, because Martha Bancroft had grown up on a farm and knew what made land work, and their conversations about the land became a kind of shared imagining that was its own form of intimacy. He was saving every dollar he could spare. It was slow work because livery wages were not generous, but he was methodical about it. He had been methodical about it for 2 years already, but now the saving had a different quality, because now the land was not just an abstract future but a future with a specific shape, a specific kitchen window, a specific person standing in it. Consuelo knew. Consuelo knew everything, in the way that women who have lived long enough and paid enough attention always know things before they are told. She watched Roy and Martha with an expression of warm approval and occasionally said things like, "The gate is staying unlocked these days," when Roy came by after dark, which was her way of saying she understood and was for it. What Martha did not know, because Roy was keeping it close, was that he had gone to see Everton Price in his capacity as Justice of the Peace, not about legal standing this time, but about the parcel of land east of town, and about whether a man on a livery worker's savings was getting anywhere close to making an offer on it. Price had told him the number, which was steep, and Roy had looked at it and done the math and determined that at his current pace he would have enough by autumn. He also wrote a letter, which took him 3 evenings to compose because he was not a natural letter writer and kept starting over, to Martha's mother in Chihuahua. He wrote it in Spanish imperfect but honest, and he introduced himself and explained his situation and his intentions and asked for her blessing, which he understood was the proper thing to do, and also the thing he genuinely wanted, not because it was required, but because he respected Martha enough to know that her family's opinion mattered to her. He gave the letter to Martha to read before he sent it, because it seemed wrong to send it without her knowledge, and because some things should not be surprises. She read it at the kitchen table while he sat across from her, watching her face. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him, and she did not say anything for a moment, and he thought perhaps he had done something wrong, and then she said, "You wrote to my mother." "Yes," he said. "You asked for her blessing." "Yes," he said again. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at the letter and then looked at him, and her eyes were bright, though she did not cry because Martha rarely cried. "My father would have liked you," she said. He did not know what to say to that, so he just sat there, and after a moment she folded the letter carefully and said, "I will add a few lines of my own and we will send it together." Her mother's reply came 6 weeks later, a letter of 3 pages in a handwriting that was small and dense, and Martha read it at the kitchen table with Consuelo beside her, and then read it again alone, and then showed it to Roy that evening on the porch. He read it slowly, working through the handwriting and the idioms, and he got the essential meaning. Her mother was very sorry for what had happened with the Hennessy arrangement. She was very glad her daughter had found something better. She had many questions about Roy Wells, and her blessing was given. "She wants to know if you are Catholic," Martha said. He glanced at her. "Is that important?" "To her, somewhat," she said. "To me, less so. I told her you were a man who listened, which I think is more important." "What did she say?" Martha almost smiled. "She said to tell her you are also not ugly." He laughed, which startled both of them because he laughed so rarely and always unexpectedly, and she laughed too, and Consuelo called from inside wanting to know what was funny, and Martha called back in Spanish and Consuelo laughed also, and the evening settled around the boarding house like something warm and entire. In September, Roy bought the land. He had the money by the last week of August, saved up from 4 years of livery work and careful living, and Everton Price drew up the papers with the precise gravity of a small man who took the large moments of other people's lives very seriously. And Roy signed them and paid and stood in the street outside Price's office with the deed in his hands, looking at the paper and thinking about what it meant. He went to find Martha. She was at the seamstress shop, finishing a hem on a skirt for the wife of the telegraph operator, and she looked up when the door opened and he came in, and she read something in his face before he said a word. "You got it," she said. "I got it," he said. She set the skirt down and came around the table, and he held the deed out and she took it and looked at it, and he watched her looking at it, her eyes moving over the land description and the boundaries and his name on the document. "Our land," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "Roy." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, which was not elaborate, a simple band of silver with a small piece of turquoise set in it, which he had bought from a Navajo silversmith who occasionally passed through Harlan Creek on the way to Santa Fe, and which was the most beautiful thing he had been able to find. And he stood there in the seamstress shop in the September afternoon with the ring and the deed, and said, in Spanish, because some things he still wanted to be perfectly understood, "Martha Bancroft, will you marry me? Will you build that place with me? Will you belong here with me?" She looked at him, and then at the ring, and then at him again. "Yes," she said in English, clear and steady. "Yes, Roy, I will." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment and then looked up at him, and he leaned forward and kissed her, which was the first time, and it was not dramatic or grand, just honest and warm and exactly right, the way everything between them had been from the first morning on. Iris Hartwell watched this from the corner of the shop where she had been very carefully not looking at them, and when they broke apart she said, "Well, it's about time," without looking up from her own hem. They were married in October, on a Saturday, in a small ceremony at the boarding house that Consuelo organized with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of a grandmother. The justice of the peace did the official part. Consuelo and Iris Hartwell and June Perry from the bakery were there, and Angus MacTavish from the livery, and a few others from town who had, over the months, come around to the opinion that Martha Bancroft was the kind of person a town was better for having. Edna Crawley sent a jar of preserves. Martha wore her blue dress, freshly cleaned and pressed, with the turquoise ring on her finger, and Roy wore a white shirt that Consuelo had starched, and he stood at the front of Consuelo's sitting room looking at Martha walking toward him and found himself thinking, with a clarity that was almost startling, that he had been moving toward this moment his whole adult life without knowing it, that all the years of drifting and working and not quite finding the right shape for things had been, in a way he could not have planned, bringing him here, to this boarding house in Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, on this October Saturday, standing in front of this woman. They said their vows with Everton Price reading the English and Roy echoing in Spanish for Martha's sake, though by now she understood most of the English on her own. When Price said, "You may kiss the bride," Roy lifted her hand first and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, which she had not expected, and she looked at him, and the look was everything. And then he kissed her properly, and Consuelo made a sound that she maintained afterward was simply clearing her throat. They moved into the small house at the edge of Harlan Creek that Roy had been building with weekend work and MacTavish's help, a two-room structure of adobe that was modest but solid, with a front porch that faced west to catch the evening colors and a kitchen that was bigger than the front room, which Martha had insisted on, and Roy had agreed to immediately because he had eaten her cooking and priorities were clear. Building the house had been one of the best summers of Roy's life, even with the hard work, because Martha had been there for much of it, bringing water and making opinions about windows known, and because there was something about building a thing together that got into you in a way that very few other activities matched. The first night in the house, they sat on the porch in the dark after supper and listened to the desert being quiet, which is a specific and particular sound, and Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For staying," she said. "On that first day, on the street, when everyone else went inside." He put his arm around her. "I could not have done otherwise," he said honestly. "I didn't even decide to, I just walked toward you." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is what made it matter." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold by New Mexico standards, but mild by most other measures. And it passed the way good winters pass when you have a warm house and good company, slowly and pleasantly, with long evenings by the fire and the particular comfort of learning a person's habits in close quarters. The way they take their coffee, and the hours they sleep best, and the expression they make when they are working through a problem, and the sound of their voice in the morning before it has fully woken up. Roy kept working at the livery, and Martha kept taking piecework from Iris Hartwell, and they were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and self-sufficient, and the house filled slowly with small things. A good cast iron pot that Martha found at the dry goods store, a set of curtains she made herself, a painting of the mountains that Roy bought from a passing traveler for 50 cents, and hung on the wall in the front room where it made the room look better immediately. Martha's English continued its relentless improvement. By December, it was good enough that she could go into town and conduct most of her business without any difficulty, though she still occasionally asked Roy to help her with something complicated or official, and he was always glad to, and they both knew it was not really about the language anymore when she asked. She began writing longer letters to her family in Chihuahua and to receiving longer letters back, and she would read them to Roy in the evenings, translating as she went, keeping him connected to the people who were still far away but who were real to him through her telling. Her brother Louis was growing fast and wanted to be a rancher. Her sisters were both well. Her mother had planted new tomatoes and wanted to know if Martha had found a garden spot at the house. "Tell her yes," Roy said. "Tell her to send seeds." Martha wrote this down, and at the end added that her husband asked her mother to send seeds, and her mother, apparently, was very pleased by this, because the following letter contained an entire packet of seeds from her garden and a note that said, in handwriting Martha read to him, "A man who cares about the garden is a man who plans to stay." He was planning to stay. He had never, in his entire adult life, been planning to stay anywhere with this degree of conviction, and it was something he thought about sometimes with a kind of wondering that was different from contentment, wider and more surprised, like a man who had expected a small room and found a whole landscape. In the spring of 1883, Martha told him she was expecting a child. She told him the way she told him most important things, directly and without ceremony, sitting across the breakfast table, watching his face to read it. His face was something to read. He sat very still for a moment, and then something crossed it that was so purely unguarded she would remember it for the rest of her life. A joy that was too large for his expression to contain properly, that sat on his features like bright light on a surface that was not meant to hold it, spilling past all the usual containment. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hands with both of his, and he looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, which was its own eloquence. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you?" "I am," he started, and then he laughed that rare surprised laugh and shook his head. "I am very well," he said. He went to work that morning with the expression of a man carrying a secret that was too good to share quietly, and Angus MacTavish took one look at him in the stable doorway and said, "What's happened to you?" "Nothing," Roy said in the voice of a man who meant the opposite. MacTavish squinted at him. "That is the face of a man who just found out he's going to be a father," he said. Roy looked at him. "How did you know?" MacTavish shrugged, heaving a saddle blanket. "I've seen the face before, on myself a few times. Congratulations, Roy." The news traveled through Harlan Creek, the way news always traveled through small towns, which is to say quickly and with embellishments, but the essential fact of it was met with general warmth. Even Edna Crawley came by the house with a pot of soup and said, somewhat stiffly but sincerely enough, that she hoped everything went well, which was as close to an olive branch as Edna Crawley offered and was accepted as such. Martha managed the pregnancy the way she managed everything, practically and without fuss, but she accepted Roy's attentions with a warmth that was different from her usual self-sufficiency, and he paid more attention than she realized, which was to say he was always aware of her, always making sure she was comfortable, always coming home from the livery in the middle of the day to check on her, which she protested and was secretly grateful for. The child was born in November, on a cold, clear morning that smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, with Consuelo doing the delivery because Harlan Creek had a doctor who was good with cattle and indifferent with people, and whose bedside manner left considerable room for improvement. Consuelo had brought more people into the world than she could count, and she brought this one in with the ease of experience and the gentleness of someone who understood exactly what she was handling. A boy. Roy was waiting in the front room, which was the longest wait of his life by a considerable margin, and when Consuelo came to the doorway with the child wrapped in flannel and said, "Roy, come meet your son," he crossed the room in 2 steps and stood looking at this small, red-faced, furiously alive person, with an expression that Consuelo would describe later to Martha as like a man who just understood a language he had been hearing all his life. He held the baby very carefully, the way you hold something you cannot afford to drop, and looked at his face, and then looked at Martha, who was propped against the pillows watching him with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just done something enormous and knows it. "What do we call him?" Roy said. "I have been thinking," Martha said. "What do you think of Tomás after my father?" Roy looked at the baby. "Tomás Wells," he said. "Yes, that is right." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and for a long time he did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The room was warm and the fire was going, and the desert morning was cold and silver outside the window, and inside this small adobe house that they had built together, everything was exactly as it should be. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, so much happening that it is difficult to separate one thing from the next, but all of it adding up to something that could be called, without exaggeration, a life. Tomás grew and walked and talked, speaking both Spanish and English from his first words onward, switching between them with the casual ease of someone who had never known a world where both were not equally real. Roy would catch him sometimes talking to the horses in Spanish, and then answering his mother's questions in English in the same breath, and it was something that made him quietly and enormously proud, not the bilingualism itself but what it represented, that this child lived in the full world of both his parents, that neither parent had been erased in the making of him. Roy expanded the house, added a second room, then a third. Got a small herd of cattle going on the land to supplement the livery income, which Martha managed the books on with a precision and care that left Roy constantly impressed. She had a head for numbers, it turned out, along with all her other qualities, and the household accounts were always in order, and the cattle operation was always financially clear, and Roy trusted her absolutely with both. Iris Hartwell retired from the seamstress shop in 1885, and she sold it to Martha for a price that was more generous than commercial, and neither of them acknowledged this, because Iris Hartwell did not acknowledge things that might be called kindness, and Martha accepted with the same clear-eyed dignity she brought to everything. The shop became Martha's, and she ran it with that same combination of precision and warmth, and she hired a young woman of 18 from a ranch outside of town named Clara, who could sew and needed work, and the two of them together ran the shop better than it had been run before. The town had changed around Martha too, gradually and unevenly, but undeniably. When she walked down the main street of Harlan Creek in 1885, she was not the foreign woman who had arrived on the stagecoach not knowing where she was going to sleep. She was Martha Wells, who ran the seamstress shop and sat on the committee for the new schoolhouse, and whose son Tomás could usually be found in someone's yard, or at the livery with his father, and whose husband Roy was the man everyone called when something complicated needed to be said simply. Her English was now, by any measure, excellent. She occasionally made small errors of idiom that she didn't notice, and that Roy never corrected because he found them charming, and she still thought in Spanish first on very tired evenings, and sometimes dreamed in it, and always sang in it, which was still one of the most affecting sounds Roy Wells had encountered in his life. Dale Hennessy had left town the year before, moved to Colorado, which suited everyone including presumably Dale Hennessy. His leaving had not been dramatic or formal, just a departure, and the town closed over the gap he left the way water closes over a stone. Consuelo Delgado was still at her boarding house, still with the red geraniums in the window boxes, still running her household with the efficiency of someone who has seen everything and retained her warmth through all of it. She was Tomas's unofficial grandmother in every practical sense, and he visited her every week and she fed him and told him stories, and Martha and Roy both understood that their family, here in Harlan Creek, was wider than just the three of them. In the late summer of 1886, Martha told Roy she was expecting again. He was better at containing himself this time, which is to say he made it almost entirely to the porch before the expression took over his face, and Martha, watching him from the doorway, allowed herself a real laugh. "You are making that face again," she said. "What face?" "The face like you have just received very good news," she said. He came back to the doorway and looked at her. "I have," he said. "This time Consuelo delivered a daughter in April of 1887 on a morning of particular New Mexico beauty, when the desert was doing its brief spring abundance and the air was warm and clean, and the light had that quality that sometimes settled over the high desert like a gift. They named her Elena after Roy's mother, who had died when he was 15, and who he almost never talked about but whom Martha had understood from the few things he had said to have been someone worth remembering. Roy held Elena for the first time, and she was very small and fair-haired, which surprised him, because Tomas had been dark like Martha, and he stood there holding this small, pale person and looked up at Martha with an expression she would also remember forever, a wonder that was of a different quality than the wonder for Tomas, not less but differently shaped, the wonder of discovering that love does not divide but multiplies. "Elena Wells," Martha said from the pillows. "Say her name." "Elena Wells," he said, looking at his daughter. "Hello, Elena." Tomas, who was 3 and very interested in the proceedings, came to stand beside his father and looked at his sister with the studied gravity of a child evaluating something new. He reached out one finger and touched her hand. "She is very small," he informed Roy seriously. "She is," Roy agreed. "She will get bigger," Tomas said, with the authority of someone who has personal experience of this. "She will," Roy agreed again and looked at Martha, and Martha was laughing quietly, and the room was warm and full of light. The years continued. Tomas started school, which Martha had helped campaign for, the schoolhouse being something the town had needed for years, and finally built in 1885 with a teacher brought from Albuquerque. He was a serious, curious student who read voraciously and asked questions that sometimes alarmed the teacher by their precision, and he was good with people and good with horses, both of which he had inherited from somewhere in the parentage. Elena grew into a child of considerable personality, not quiet like her father or measured like her mother, but something between them, warm and enthusiastic, and very loud in moments of enthusiasm, which she got from no one anyone could identify, but which pleased them both enormously. She had Martha's directness and Roy's stubbornness, and her own particular combination of these qualities that was entirely herself. Martha's mother came to visit in the summer of 1888. She came on the stagecoach from Albuquerque, the same route Martha had made 6 years earlier under such different circumstances, and Roy was at the stop waiting with Martha when the coach pulled in, and he saw, when the door opened and the small, compact, fierce-looking woman stepped down and immediately swept Martha into her arms, exactly where Martha had come from in every sense. His mother-in-law, a woman named Francisca, who had the same direct eyes as her daughter and the same habit of looking at you in a way that suggested she had made up her mind about you already, but was being polite enough to let the conversation play out, stood at the stop and looked at Roy Wells for a long moment, and Roy held very still under the assessment. Then she said something in Spanish that was very fast and that he caught about half of, which was enough to understand that she was saying she had expected a man who would look somehow different, more obviously exceptional, and that he looked like an ordinary man, but that her daughter had told her things about him that she had considered carefully, and that she was inclined to believe what her daughter said. He said, in Spanish, "Your daughter is the most remarkable person I have ever known." I understand why you trust what she tells you." Francisca looked at him, and then she did what Martha did, that brief flash of warmth that was there and gone but unmistakable. "Good," she said. She stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in the room they had prepared for her, making the kitchen smell of things he could not identify but that were extraordinary, teaching Alina Spanish songs, and telling Tomas stories about his grandfather that made the boy's eyes go wide with a combination of admiration and disbelief. She and Consuelo met and liked each other immediately, and spent an afternoon together on Consuelo's porch that Roy was not privy to, but that seemed to make both women very satisfied. She and Roy found their footing over those 3 weeks in the careful, respectful way that two people find it when they share a love for the same person and have the sense to let that be sufficient ground. She corrected his Spanish several times, briskly and without apology, and he received the corrections with gratitude which seemed to please her. On the morning she was leaving, she took both his hands in hers, which were small and very strong, and said to him, "She is happy. You have made her happy." "That is what I wanted to know. She has made me happy first," he said. Francisca shook her head at this, the way a woman does when a man says something she considers somewhat beside the point, and then she embraced him, briefly and firmly, and went to say her last goodbyes to the children. He watched her go and felt the warmth of it, the completeness of it, the way the circle had closed. After she left, Martha was quiet for a day, the particular quiet of missing someone who is well and just distant, the kind of sadness that is mostly gratitude with a layer of longing on top of it. Roy stayed close, did not push for talk, just made sure she was never in a room entirely alone if she did not want to be. The evening after her mother left, he found her on the porch, looking west at the sky, and he sat down beside her and she leaned into him and he put his arm around her and they sat in the kind of silence that is not empty but is instead full of everything that does not need to be said. "I miss her already," Martha said. "I know," he said. "She liked you," she said. "I know," he said. "I liked her too." She was quiet for a moment. "She told me that Papa would have liked you." "The same thing I told you before we were married." He held her a little closer. "What was he like?" She told him, and the story unspooled in the evening dark, and he listened the way he had always listened to her, with his whole attention, because she was worth it and had always been worth it. In 1889, the territory was changing around them. The railroad had come through the lower part of New Mexico and was bringing new people and new goods and new arguments, and Harlan Creek, while not on the main line, was close enough to feel the changes. New families came. The town grew by a third in 2 years. The schoolhouse needed to expand. A doctor came, a real one this time, a young man from Ohio named Fletcher, who had proper training and a manner that was both competent and actually kind. Roy, with the cattle operation established and the livery now employing 2 additional men, began thinking about the future in a different way, not survival future, not practical future, but the longer arc of it, what he and Martha were building toward and what it would mean for the children. He was 40 years old in 1889, still lean and strong, still quiet, still the man who listened, and he had more certainty about who he was and where he was than he had possessed at any previous point in his life. Martha was 31. She ran the seamstress shop and 3 employees now, and had become one of the people in town that other people came to when they needed something done, not because she was the loudest voice in any room, but because she was reliable and fair, and because her word, when she gave it, was a finished thing. She had also, quietly and without making it into an announcement, become one of the people that the small Mexican and Hispanic families in and around Harlan Creek came to first when they needed to navigate something official, because she could move in both languages and both worlds, and she understood what it meant to arrive in a place and not know the language, and she helped with a practical and unpatronizing efficiency that made the difference between a difficult situation and an impossible one. Roy watched this over the years and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in 1882 into a street full of people who had decided she was not their problem, and about what she had built herself into in this place. And he thought that bravery was not always loud or dramatic, and that sometimes the most extraordinary thing a person does is simply to stay and build, one day at a time, until the thing you built is bigger and better than anything you imagined when you started. He told her this one evening when the children were in bed, and they were sitting in the front room with the lamp going and the sound of the night wind against the house. She looked at him. "You say things sometimes," she said, "that I do not expect." "Is that bad?" he said. "No," she said. "It is why I have never gotten tired of talking to you." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat for a while with the fire going low and the desert quiet outside and the children sleeping in the back, and it was one of the ordinary evenings that contained everything. The spring of 1891 brought a letter from Chihuahua that was not entirely good news. Martha's brother Louis, now 24, was in a difficult situation. A drought had hit the region hard, and the family farm was struggling, and Francisca was not as strong as she had been. Martha read the letter twice and put it down and looked at Roy. "I want to bring them here," she said. He looked at her. "Your mother and Louis, and the girls if they want to come. Rosario and Pilar are old enough to make their own choice." He thought about it for a moment, not because he was uncertain he was not, but because he was doing the practical calculation where they would live, how Louis would find work, whether the timing worked. "Yes," he said, "let's bring them here." She looked at him with a relief and a gratitude that was large and quiet. "It will change things," she said, "having family here. It will change them for the better," he said. It took the better part of a year to arrange, the letters going back and forth, the plans taking shape, the practical obstacles being one by one resolved. Roy spoke to Angus MacTavish about Louis, who was a capable horseman, and MacTavish agreed to take him on at the livery. Consuelo had a room available for Francisca, because Consuelo always had a room available for whoever needed it, and the boarding house had shrunk in terms of paying guests as the town had built more housing and expanded. Louis arrived first, in January of 1892, on the same stagecoach line that had brought Martha 10 years before. He was tall and dark and had the look of their father, which Martha had told Roy about and which Roy recognized instantly from her descriptions. He stepped off the stagecoach into the winter morning and looked around, and Martha crossed the street and embraced her brother, and he held her, and they spoke rapidly in Spanish, and Roy stood slightly back, holding Tomás's hand. Louis looked over Martha's shoulder at Roy, and Roy held out his hand. Louis took it and shook it and said in careful, studied English that he had clearly been practicing, "I am glad to meet you. My sister tells me good things." Roy replied in Spanish, because it seemed like the right response to the effort being made, and Louis's face broke into a smile that was exactly like Martha's when it appeared, there and warm and real. "We will get along," Roy said. "Yes," Louis said. "I think so." Francisca came in the spring with Rosario, who was now 23 and who had, it turned out, a sweetheart in Chihuahua who was coming north himself when he had enough saved. Pilar was 20, and she came too, and the house on the edge of Harlan Creek was suddenly full in a way that was loud and warm and chaotic, and exactly what Roy, who had spent so many years in a quiet of his own making, had not known he was missing until it arrived. The children, Tomás, who was 9, and Alina, who was 5, absorbed their grandmother and aunts and uncle with the adaptability of children who have grown up in both languages and both worlds. Tomás became Louis's shadow within the first week, following him everywhere at the livery, absorbing everything about horses that Louis had to teach, which was considerable. Alina attached herself to Rosario with a completeness that suggested she had been waiting for an aunt all her life. Francisca sat on the porch of the house and looked out at the New Mexico desert and said something to Martha that Martha translated for Roy later as, "I understand now why you stayed." It was in the summer of 1892, on a Saturday morning when the house was full of the smell of coffee and Francisca's cooking, and the sound of children and Louis arguing cheerfully with Rosario about something Roy could only half follow, that Roy stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room and looked at all of it and felt something so complete and rounded that he did not have adequate English or Spanish for it. Martha came up beside him. She had a cup of coffee in each hand, and she gave him one and looked at where he was looking. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking about a stagecoach," he said, "and about a woman standing in the street." She looked at him. "I'm thinking about walking around the corner of a livery stable," he said, "and seeing someone standing alone in the middle of a street full of people who had all gone inside, and thinking that I should go talk to her." "And what do you think now?" she said. He looked at her. 10 years from that first morning, and she was still able to surprise him, still able to say things he did not expect, still able to stop him in the middle of an ordinary day with the particular quality of her attention. "I think it was the best walk I ever took," he said. She handed him his coffee and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and straightened up, because Martha Wells did not stay still for long when there was a kitchen full of family and things to be done. But she reached back for his hand for just a moment and squeezed it. He held on. The years continued to turn, as years do, each one different from the last, but all of them building on the same foundation. Rosario's sweetheart arrived from Chihuahua, a solid young man named Esteban, who was a carpenter and who found, to his evident pleasure, that there was considerable need for a good carpenter in a growing town, and he and Rosario were married the following year. Pilar stayed and worked at the seamstress shop, and eventually married a young rancher named Henry Coles, whose family had been in New Mexico territory 2 generations, and who spoke no Spanish when they met, and a good deal of it 2 years later, because Pilar was as relentless a teacher as Martha, and Henry Coles had the sense to apply himself. Lewis became indispensable at the livery, and eventually Angus MacTavish, who was getting old and had no children of his own, sold him a share in the business, a transaction that Roy had facilitated quietly but without drawing attention to his own role in it, because it was the right outcome and did not need to be made into anything more than what it was. Francisca Bancroft grew old on Consuelo's porch, and in Roy and Martha's kitchen, with a grace and solidity that made her a fixed star in all of their lives. She and Consuelo became the kind of friends who do not need to talk constantly to be in each other's company, and they sat together on Consuelo's porch on summer afternoons in a silence that was entirely full. Tomás grew into a young man who was, as Roy had suspected early on, going to be someone worth watching. He was intelligent and warm and honest, and he had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and his own particular combination that was better than either, the way good combinations always are. He worked the cattle and helped at the livery and read every book he could get his hands on, and when he was 18 he told his parents with some ceremony that he wanted to study law. Roy looked at Martha. Martha looked at Roy. "I think," Roy said carefully, "that the world could use a lawyer who speaks both English and Spanish and knows what it means to arrive somewhere strange and need someone to listen." Tomás looked at him with the steady, serious look he had had since he was a child. "That is exactly what I was thinking," he said. "They found a way. It was not simple, and it was not cheap, and it required sacrifice from everyone. But it was the kind of sacrifice that does not feel like sacrifice because you understand what it is building." Tomás went to Albuquerque to study, and then to Santa Fe, and the letters that came back from him were full and detailed, and told them everything about where he was and what he was learning. And Martha read them aloud in the evenings, and Roy listened, and they were both very proud in the way that is larger than pride, that is closer to wonder. Elena, who was loud and enthusiastic and very certain about everything from an early age, decided at 17 that she was going to be a teacher. This surprised no one who had met her, since she had been instructing everyone in her vicinity since she could talk. She taught at the schoolhouse in Harlan Creek for 1 year after completing her training, and then the teacher in the next town over retired and Elena went there, which was 12 miles, which was acceptable, and she came home on weekends, which made the kitchen loud and warm in the particular way it only was when Alina was in it. Roy turned 50 in 1899, a number that arrived with less weight than he had expected because he felt, genuinely, less diminished by time than enriched by it, which he understood was not something everyone could say, and which he did not take for granted. Martha was 41 and still ran the seamstress shop, though it had become less piecework and more management now, with 3 employees and a reputation that had spread to the surrounding towns. She sat on the town council. She had taught English informally to more people than she could count, mostly women who arrived in Harlan Creek not knowing the language, whom she spotted at once and went to immediately, because she remembered exactly what it was to stand in a street and not be understood. The 20th century arrived in Harlan Creek with the sound of a new bell that someone had donated to the church, rung in by everyone who was awake and willing, which in Harlan Creek was most of the population. Roy and Martha stood on their porch and listened to the bell and to the distant sounds of the celebration, and the desert night was very clear and very cold, and the stars were the particular brightness of winter stars. "A new century," Martha said. "Yes," he said. "What do you think it will bring?" He considered the question seriously because she asked it seriously. "I think it will bring things we cannot imagine," he said. "Good and difficult both. It always does." She nodded. "And we will manage them," she said, not as a question. "We will manage them," he said. She tucked herself against his side and he wrapped his arm around her, and they stood in the cold of the new century looking at the old stars, and after a while she said very quietly, "Roy." "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me the first day on the street?" He thought back. 20 years nearly, but the memory was precise. "I said hola," he said, "and then I said let me help you, and I asked if you were looking for someone. And you said," she continued, "that everyone else went inside." "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think about that sometimes, about how different everything would have been if you had also gone inside." He held her closer. "I could not have gone inside," he said. "You were standing there." She made a small sound that was somewhere between a breath and a word and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and he stood holding his wife on the porch of the house they had built together in the first moments of the 20th century, and thought that this was the shape of a life, this accumulation of morning by morning, this patient building of something worth staying for. Tomás came home from Santa Fe in the spring of that first year of the new century, with a law certificate and a wife named Anna, who was from a family in Santa Fe with deep roots and a large garden, and who looked at the Wells family and their house and their complicated, warm, two-language life with an expression of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for without knowing they were looking. Roy shook his son's hand at the stagecoach stop and then embraced him, which was not something Roy did commonly, and Tomás held on, and over his shoulder Roy saw Martha watching them with the expression she reserved for moments that cost her nothing and meant everything. Tomás set up his law practice in Harlan Creek because the town needed one and because he had been planning to come home since the beginning, and the practice grew steadily because Tomás was exactly what Roy had predicted a decade earlier, a man who spoke both languages and knew what it meant to need to be understood. He handled land disputes and business arrangements, and wills, and more than a few cases involving families who had arrived in New Mexico territory speaking no English, and found themselves at the wrong end of a system that was not designed to be easy to navigate without help. Roy watched his son work with the same wondering pride that had been building for 30 years, and thought sometimes about the chain of things, about a stagecoach and a street, and the words hola and help, about the way a single moment of staying can travel forward through time in ways you cannot see from where you are standing. Consuelo Delgado died in the summer of 1901, in her own bed, in her own boarding house, at the age of approximately 78, which was how old she told people she was, and was probably a slight underrepresentation of the truth. She left the boarding house to a niece in Santa Fe, and the red geraniums in the window boxes to whoever wanted to tend them, And she left Roy and Martha the cast iron pot that she had used for 30 years, which was the most useful thing she owned, and therefore the most significant bequest she could imagine. Martha sat in Consuelo's kitchen after the funeral and was quiet for a long time, and Roy sat beside her and held her hand and did not try to fill the quiet, because some things needed to be held in their full weight before you could set them down. "She was the first person who made me feel like this was home," Martha said. "I know," he said. "She said when you brought me here, you did right. Do you remember?" "I remember." "I have always thought she said that too fast," Martha said. "You had only just met me." "She was a good judge of character," Roy said. Martha was quiet. Then she said, "She told me once that she knew the first time you came by with me that you were in love with me. She said any fool could see it." Roy looked at her. "She told you that?" "She told me several months after you brought me to the door," Martha said. "She said she was waiting for me to see it myself." He shook his head slowly. "She was something," he said. "She was everything," Martha agreed. They buried her with the ceremony she deserved, and Francisca, who was old now and moved slowly, sat in the front row and wept with a dignity that was itself a tribute, because Francisca did not weep for small things. The boarding house was sold to a family passing through who decided to stay, and the red geraniums went to Martha, who put them on the porch of the house on the east edge of town, where they continued being exactly themselves in all weathers. Life continued as it does, full and textured, and neither entirely easy nor anything but worth it. The cattle operation Roy and Martha had built over the years was solid and well managed, though Roy had gradually handed more of the day-to-day to Lewis, and to a young hand Lewis had brought on, because Roy's knees were expressing opinions about long days in the saddle that he was beginning to have to respect. He was still lean, still quiet, still the man he had always been, but time had added something to him that was not diminishment but depth, the way good wood becomes more itself with age, revealing a grain that was always there but needed years to show properly. Martha had threads of gray in her dark hair that she did not hide, because Martha Bancroft Wells did not hide things simply because the world occasionally expected her to. She was 48 in 1905, and she was, Roy thought, looking at her across the breakfast table on an ordinary morning with the sun coming through the kitchen window, the most beautiful person he had ever known, in every sense that the word could mean. He said so. She looked at him over her coffee cup with that expression, the one that was almost a smile and then was entirely one. "You are partial," she said. "I am," he said. "That does not make it untrue." She set her cup down and looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and they sat there in the ordinary morning being in love in the way that people are in love when they have built something together, not the catching, falling kind but the deep and daily kind, the kind that is the same as saying I know you and I see you and I am glad of it, and that has been true for 20 years and will be true for 20 more. "Roy," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For staying," she said. The same words she had said on that first night on the porch years and years ago, and he understood that she meant the same thing and more. She meant all of it, the whole weight of the years. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand palm up and held his, and the morning sun came through the kitchen window, and the desert outside was already heating up the way it did in summer, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet now that the children were grown and making their own noise elsewhere, a quiet that was not empty but full of what it contained. "I was never going anywhere," he said. And that was the truth of it, the entire and final truth. Roy Wells, who had spent the first half of his life moving and the second half staying, had found in a woman who arrived speaking only Spanish in a town full of people who did not stay to listen, every reason he had been looking for. He had stayed on that first day because she needed someone too. He had stayed every day after because he needed her too. That distinction had collapsed somewhere in 23 years of mornings and evenings, and walking and building and children and loss, and ordinary Tuesday breakfasts, and extraordinary ordinary Saturdays, and all the specific accumulating texture of a life that two people build together when they both decide, on a porch in the desert with the stars coming out, that what they are building is worth the building. The house on the east edge of Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, stood solid and warm in the summer morning, with its 3 rooms and its good-sized kitchen and its porch that faced west, with Consuelo's red geraniums in boxes along the rail, with a garden behind it that grew tomatoes from seeds Martha's mother had sent in a letter 20 years ago. Inside, a man and a woman sat at the kitchen table with their hands together and the coffee going cold between them, in no hurry whatsoever to be anywhere but where they were, which was home, which was entirely and exactly and always home.